RAHSAAN Roland Kirk was unique. I mean, the word unique is misused a lot. Some people don't even know what it means because you can't qualify it, you know. It's unique is unique. And it's either unique or it's not.
Yeah.
RAHSAAN was an unbelievable person and musician. I knew about him already, but the first contact I had with him was back in the days when I was doing this radio show, WBAI, which is a crazy station, called The Sound of Jazz. And I had done something on John Kirby, and he called me. And he said, where can I get those records? I said, John Kirby, you wouldn't expect that, and I didn't expect it, but I was delighted, you know, that he should be interested in that. And that's how we became friendly. And much to my delight, we did become friendly. And I remember the first time I saw him was at Newport, you know, and saw him live. And before that, it was on the same weekend as the Ellington Band. And you know who told me that I should not miss him by any means was Harry Carney. Harry Carney said, don't miss this guy, and he said it's not because he can do circular breathing, which of course was the thing that Duke overused Harry for with that sophisticated lady. I had to say to myself, why don't you have Harry do something else except a bloody, you know, long, sophisticated lady? I mean, Harry, and that's a whole different subject. But I said, don't miss this guy, and not for the circular breathing, but he's something else. And Harry, I think it's the only instance where he ever said anything like that to me. I had already heard him on records, so I was prepared to hear something interesting. But he was fabulous. You've seen him live, haven't you?
Yeah.
So he was something to see live, and of course, the other amazing thing about him was that being blind, he was nevertheless visually so effective that I always had the feeling that with an inner eye, he must have had some conception of what he appeared like. And of course, there were also, you know, women who would have, the two wives that I knew, you know, Darthan, whom I got to know real well, and the first one was Eve, I think. Anyway, when I got to know RAHSAAN, I was amazed at various things. He was hugely intelligent, curious, wanting to know things that he didn't know, and communicate things that he did know, passionate about music, and had a lot of pride. He was somebody who had the guts, or chutzpah, whatever you want to call it, to do whatever came into his mind, and a lot of stuff came into his mind. I mean, unique was his interest in obsolete instruments, not because they were obsolete, but because they had some feature that he could use in his ability to play instruments simultaneously, and also to, if there were reed instruments, to figure them, you know, in certain ways that would be useful to him. The span between the keys, for instance, or where they were placed or whatnot. So he would go and the second-hand stores, even when he found some of these things he found in places like Spain or Portugal or whatever, you know. He was amazingly, being blind, he was amazingly adventurous in going out. Of course, he would have had to have somebody with him, but he also sometimes went out on his own, you know. He was extremely enterprising and imaginative, needless to say. And what he did, once you accepted, I mean, there were people who wouldn't, consider him a novelty or even, like a circus act or something or whatever. And didn't understand that everything he did, even when it was something as unusual as what he called his nose flute, that it made musical sense. He never did anything just for the sake of doing it or for the sake of novelty. It always made musical sense. And he created new sounds, But, and this is important, at the root of it was a really great musician who could do something on a single instrument that was on a very high level. And I remember one time there was a kind of semi-formal jam session because it was public. It was in a small club in the village. It wasn't the Village Vanguard. It was one of those clubs that may not have lasted very long. And there was musicians who clearly, he was very perceptive. He didn't miss a bloody thing, he had enormously good hearing. And he could hear if somebody was saying something about him if they thought he couldn't hear, he heard it. Anyway, there was clearly, some of the musicians were jealous of the fact that he got attention from the audience for doing his multiple stuff, which was visually fascinating, So he got angry and he put everything away except his tenor. And he blew everybody off the stage. And he told me later, he said, some people think that I'm, that I'm a circus actor, but I'm a musician. That's what he did, and that's what he was. He was a musician of unique imagination and using his handicap. This is to really eliminate what burden that handicap was, to do something else with it, which was completely original and uncopyable. There'll never be anybody like him again. And you can't, you couldn't do an imitation of him. You couldn't do it. Because what he did also was technically, from the standpoint of what he could do. There are other people, Wilbur Sweatman played two clarinets at the same time, but I can assure you that it was on a different level. No, really, seriously, I got to really love RAHSAAN and went out of my way to hear him often, and he would always come up with something that you hadn't heard before. And his recorded legacy is very good indeed. There's one that I particularly like, and because my memory is getting worse, it's the one that it's with Elvin, and it's called something like 1, 2, 3 or something like that. It's terrific. And people who, musicians, there were some musicians who tended to dismiss him, and as I said, as an act, and they're basically jealous of the attention that he got. And if they were on stage with him, it was very hard to, establish yourself. Rhythm section is fine, and he really pretty much had regular people who worked with him. There was a very good drummer. Was it Sonny Brown? Is that his name? Very good drummer who worked with him. They were not, famous guys, but they were good. Anyway, I remember once at Radio City Music Hall when, I guess it was it George who did the Radio City Music Hall things, Newport in New York?
July 1972.
Yeah. Well, he broke it up at that thing. He broke it up on that big stage. That was a good one, that concert. So, one time in New Orleans, festival in New Orleans, was in the afternoon with nothing was really happening. A hotel that we all stayed at had a pool, and there was some older local guys who were kind of playing like a lunchtime thing. It was informal, there was nothing about it. So RAHSAAN, he borrowed clarinet, and they were playing like New Orleans style stuff, and he just started playing in that vein beautifully. He could do practically anything. I mean, I think if I had been an A&R man, I would have liked to present him in various things. And he could be a whole, he could be a whole reed section by himself. And what he did was in tune. The blend, the intonation, and everything was there. There was nothing, sloppy about it or anything. He was remarkable. I mean, that's to say the least. There won't ever be anybody like him. And I'm very glad that I got to know him and that I, got a little close to him, because he was a beautifully warm person and totally without any negative aspects. He was he even forgave people, who put him down or, called him an act or whatever. He was a loving person, and he approached life without any bitterness about his handicap, and he was just like some, I don't know, I mean, he was like somebody who just came out of, you couldn't have invented him. He was RAHSAAN, he was Roland Kirk. And of course we know that he wasn't born into a condominium. He was special, and I'm very glad that I got to know him and got to know him pretty well. The last time I saw him was actually, I think it was actually by coincidence, met in the street in Midtown Manhattan, and I think it didn't have anything to do with what we talked about the thing of Radio City Music Hall, but it was right near there, and it could come from a rehearsal or something. And of course he was not alone, so I mean, we just happened to meet, and he embraced me, and he was strong. And like on people who play wind instruments and really play them. I could mention Louis first of all. Stan Getz. When Stan hugged me, I was amazed at the power of his chest, of him as a you can easily explain why Roy was like that too, and RAHSAAN. I mean, he was powerful. You had to use a lot of wind to do what he was doing. I mean, he would hold these notes, but everything he could do, hold the notes and then play something else on the side. And it's music, it's not, if you really take the trouble to listen to it and not just hear it as as a bunch of sound. It's very intelligently done. I mean, he knew what he was doing. So when we got to know each other, it was because of John Kirby. And I think what intrigued him about John Kirby was the ensemble sound, those three horns, the way they were voiced. Which brings us, I don't know, did we ever talk about Charlie Shavers? Really?
Yes.
We talked about Charlie, yeah. Who was another genius. The older I get, the more I like Charlie Shavers. I just recently re-listened to a session issued under the name of Eddie Laguna, who was a California disc jockey there. It's Charlie and poor Herbie Hamer, who was a fine tenor player, who was one of the main, more musicians get killed in damn road accidents than drugs or anything else. Nat Cole, in one of his far too rare excursions as a jazz piano player, he's one of the very best. To me, he's in my top 5, not top 10, but top 5. And Buddy Rich at his very best. Buddy is wonderful in this, and Charlie, and they do a thing called Laguna Leap, which is it's a fast blues, but it really is fast, and it's okay. It's one of the great tragedies in jazz, I think. Well, it's fair to say it's a tragedy that Nat Cole was such a successful singer because his piano playing is. I just recently re-listened to, I often do, to the trio Lester,
Yes.
Nat, and Buddy Rich. Oh man, I don't know. He had a touch. It was so crisp, and at the same time it had, it had sound, but it wasn't on the surface. And he had such a mind, and he had such great time. Something else. I think I mentioned that I got to hear him live once. I got to see him live once.
No, tell me. Tell.
He was at the, of all places, and the only time I've ever been there, at the Copacabana. And for somehow or other, I got myself in there. And as press, I was ringside, and it's a trio. So it was mostly singing, and it was a trio. Maybe there was a small string section or something that came in over there. He did one thing at the piano. He did one thing featuring himself at the piano. He was the most amazing looking person to see him live. He was very dark, but he had a collar. I hope it's permissible to talk about things like that and not be accused of God knows what. He had the most beautiful collar. It was like ebony, and he dressed accordingly. First time I ever saw him, I was walking down Midtown Broadway, and he was coming in the other direction with some other people. It was daytime and sunshine, so I recognized him immediately. It was not summer. A beautiful overcoat with a belt, and he was tall, so he was, he stood out. And I was so amazed at that collar, which was unlike any other that I've ever seen. It had a kind of glow to it. Beautiful. I think you can take this out because it's so, dangerous to say anything like that. But you know that there was a TV show.
Yes.
Which didn't last. I think one reason for that was that he was so dark.
Yeah.
That's one reason.
It couldn't have been musical quality.
Or charm.
Yeah.
No. Anyway, I hope that somebody discovers. There's now that somebody's putting out a complete Nat Cole thing. Did you see that mentioned
Yes.
somewhere? A huge amount of.
My friend Nick Rossi is involved in that. It's a set of something like 9 or 10 CDs of, I think, the trio with Oscar Moore. So it's earlier stuff. It's going to be wonderful.
Yeah, I want one.
Yes, so do
I'll
I.
pay for it.
On that note.